Northwest. My name is Ortwin Knorr. I'm a professor here at Willamette University, and I don't do anything with archaeology, of course. I'm actually a specialist in Roman comedy and Roman poetry. But I love archaeology, loved it since I was a child, of course. And it turns out we also have a very strong AIA chapter here on campus. We have been told it's one of the most active chapters in the entire United States, in fact. And so we usually have actually something like 6 to 8 lectures a year. With COVID, we've had to definitely reduce that a lot. But at least this semester, we're probably going to have 3, which is cool. And this is actually an experiment. It is the first Zoom lecture, virtual lecture ever hosted by the Classical Association of the Pacific Northwest. And of course, we are hosting this jointly with the local AIA chapter, the Archaeological Institute of America. And for those who don't know, I should say that this is the oldest academic association anywhere in the United States. I think 1879, correct me, Scott, if I'm wrong. So it's a little bit older than CAPIN, which was only founded in 1911. It is also very unusual in that it combines not just academics and high school teachers, but literally anybody who is in any way interested in archaeology can become a member. And if you are new to the field here, then we would like you to know that should you be a member, you are actually financing these kinds of events, because then we can allow people to travel here. Obviously, this event is a lot cheaper than it normally would be because we don't have to actually host our speaker. And our speaker can tonight probably sleep in her own bed, which is also a nice change, probably. Yeah, so anyway, welcome to all of you. And I have the honor to ask my colleague to actually introduce it. Rob Chenault is my colleague in classics and history here. Rob, would you please introduce the speaker tonight?
Yes, thank you, Ortwin, and welcome to both our CAPIN colleagues from all around the Northwest. I see many of you here, and to our hometown members of the Salem Society of the Archaeological Institute of America. My name is Rob Chenault, and I'm an associate professor of history and classical studies at Willamette University, as well as the program coordinator of the Salem AIA. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces from near and far. A welcome reminder that Zoom, while not ideal, does open up some interesting possibilities for regional collaborations and remote attendance. For our Salem AIA members, please note that we will have our next lecture 2 weeks from tonight on Thursday, October 21st at 7:30 p.m. This will also be a Zoom event for which we are pleased to have a talk by Dr. Marcus Milwright of the University of Victoria on the role of writing in the propagation of religious ideology in early Islam. Tonight, we extend a warm digital welcome, much delayed, to Dr. Stephanie Sullivan. Stephanie is an assistant professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Washington. She has published several articles on the archaeology of ancient Anatolia and is currently finishing her first monograph, provisionally titled Excavating War, the Archaeology of Violence, Power, and Urbanism in Prehistoric Anatolia. I say much delayed because Stephanie was originally scheduled to deliver this talk in person on March 12th, 2020. It was a flurry of emails back and forth in early March that ultimately resulted in canceling Stephanie's visit to Salem. And in a way, the cancellation of that event was my first indication that our world and our lives were going to be dramatically different for a while. We are especially pleased to be able to make good that loss tonight with Stephanie's lecture on women, weapons, and warfare, weapons and burial goods from Old Kingdom Egypt to early Bronze Age Anatolia. I will also take this moment to remind everyone to please be sure their microphones are muted to minimize distractions and background noise. Also, please note that Dr. Sullivan's lecture will be followed by a brief response from Dr. Mary Bachvarova, the Lindsay and Corinne Stewart Professor in the Humanities, and our colleague here in the Department of Classical Studies. After the lecture and response, the floor will be opened up to questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Sullivan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. And thank you for coming out on this Zoom night. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to everybody today in this very long delayed talk. As a bit of introduction, I can go ahead and start my share screen perhaps. All right, there we go. So this is a project that I've actually recently published on. This is an article that came out in Journal of Conflict Archaeology in the last couple of months. That is, I think, titled in the line of Women, Weapons, and Warfare: The Dangerous Lives of Early Bronze Age Anatolian Women. Today's talk is a slightly elongated in some ways version of this. So my initial project was a comparison between burial weapons found in both early Bronze Age Anatolia, which I'll explain what these terms mean, as well as Old Kingdom Egypt. The paper became a little unwieldy in length, so I'm hoping in the future to publish the Egyptian end on this in the future. So that is my initial bit here. And this begins as one of the ways I was kind of inspired with this when I was working on projects. My primary research is looking at evidence of warfare in the prehistoric past. And in part of this, I've made large databases of all kinds of evidence of warfare, looking especially at evidence of injury on human remains, as well as the types of weapons being buried with bodies. And I've made just huge numbers of databases over the years, over thousands of years of history, particularly in Anatolia, and we're also working my way through Egypt and hopefully eventually through the Levant as well. And one of the issues I come up with a lot is the ways that people ignore gender, especially when it comes to violence. Violence and warfare is seen as a very masculine part of life and part of culture, and anybody who therefore has a weapon must be male just by default. And this is a common enough issue. And even in my own work, I'm sad to admit, when I was going through my database, it never even occurred to me to look for evidence of women with weapons. That's my own kind of beginning. I admit that I did this. So there's kind of a famous thing that came out a couple years ago, was this idea of this warrior grave found in Russia, this warrior king, as they kept saying over and over again, found with large numbers of weapons and glitzy things. And he was found lying down with a sword by his side with the weapons next to it. And nearby was a smaller container with the cremated remains of somebody else, thought to be, of course, his lady wife. So far, so normal. So you can see here, this publication on it, this male warrior laying down all kinds of very cool little doodads and warrior field things next to him, and a cremated remains next. So this was done, found a while ago and published and so on and so forth. But upon more recent evaluation based on bioarchaeological, so actually looking at the bones and doing metric analysis of the remains, it was about actually, this is a difference, this was in fact a woman. And the remains of this person was in fact a female, and the remains inside the cremated area were those of a male. And people got very upset, and you get some stuff really pretty quickly going from a warrior to this idea of a warrior princess, and suddenly the words really change incredibly quickly once you change the gender of this person being found inside a tomb. So when it comes to concepts of women with weapons in archaeological contexts, how people discuss these and the language being used is really, really heavy-handed. As you can see here, so there's two different cases here. I realize I slightly messed it up. But there's one of the Etruscan burial and one of this Viking burial. So this is something that happens again and again and again. If you actually do the metric analysis of the remains, it might not always be as male-centric as you initially think. So there's lots of examples of this. And so we come to this idea of the warrior woman, which is seen, and it's very common enough part in modern day culture and popular culture. And of course, the most famous of these in terms of mythologies are the Amazons. More recently, of course, has been a series of movies about the Amazons coming through Marvel with Wonder Woman and their ideas of warrior type, all female mythological places that are fantastic and so on and so forth. And to more realistic ones like the Scythians, or a series of nomadic warrior groups throughout Central Asia, who in fact do have high numbers of warrior women and are seen as the real Amazons. There's some fantastic articles on those as well. But what you often get, though, when it comes to the concepts, how people try to explain away the presence of women involved in war, is a couple different ways. The first is some sort of token woman. So you watch any kind of cartoon show for kids, there's always that one woman involved in the group of men who's there to hang with the boys. So you can have an idea of a token female who's involved for some reason. And also the occasional famous woman warrior. So Boudica of Roman fame, who is going up against the evil Roman warriors defending her people. But often when it comes to women being involved in this kind of bloody business, it must be because of some unwomanly version like revenge. Women do not just naturally go into war. And so there's lots of explaining away, and more often not, especially modern society, as well as you would see in Greek and Roman depictions of Amazons, very highly sexualized. When women are fighting, you see this again in Marvel, they're wearing thigh-high boots, breastplates that accentuate rather than actually bring things down, and very tight clothing that would be very difficult to actually fight in. So this is kind of how things are often shown. Along with this is the way that women are often discussed in a large part, especially in ancient Near Eastern concepts of art history. So I bring for you an example here is this very famous throne from the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt and New Kingdom. This very tender scene you see here of his wife Akhenamun touching his arm while he sits, and you will find discussions of this in which they talk about how very manly he is, this kind of skirts he wearing, and the language used for Tutankhamun in a lot of these discussions will talk about the manly attributes of how you see him, and for her about her long flowing dresses and all her dazzling jewelry. But take a look again and you'll see these two people are wearing exactly the same amount of jewelry. He has on, in fact, a little bit more. His wrists bracelets are a bit larger. His throne, of course, is all, yeah, he's wearing quite a lot of bling is what I really want to say here. And so is she. So a lot of concepts of what is considered to be gendered by modern society is not how people saw these things in the past. And again, there's some fantastic different reports coming out of various areas about the ways that the way we see makeup, the way we see jewelry as gendered in the present day are not present in the past. And so why do I combine these things? To show that our modern perceptions of what is highly gendered do not reflect past perceptions of gender, which is not to say that, of course, the past was any kind of utopia with no gender differences at all, but our modern perceptions of what is important for gender differences is not necessarily those of the past. So when it comes to the study of skeletons, of burials, of burial goods, and sex and gender in the ancient past, this has been a major problem in archaeological publications, especially those of the 19th and up to the mid-20th century, perhaps even a little bit later. And I do think in the modern day, we are working more and more to go through this and to stop using just our perceptions of gender to say what the sex of an ancient person was. And I think, as you can see in my initial examples, going back into past publications can give us very different conclusions than those initially came up with. So how do we understand issues of gender and sex in the ancient world? And of course, there's a difference between these two terms, sex being a biological aspect of humans, as opposed to gender, the ways in which people perform these various aspects of sex or gender as perceived by society and by people themselves. So my project here is looking at how do we go back through these records and perhaps try to pick apart more intricately the role of women in warfare, especially before the rise of large empires and during the rise of urbanism, and what were women's roles in this early warfare, and how to disentangle our own concepts of gender and gender roles from how people actually perceived those in the past, using a large amount of evidence, especially from archaeology, art history, as well as even some aspects of mythology. So the biases in mortuary archaeology, as I already said, is it's very easy and much easier, in fact, to take a skeleton and say, oh, this person has weapons and this person has pots and these kinds of things, and these are masculine, and to just use that instead of actually using metric evidence, DNA evidence, or in fact, any kind of more scientific basis for what the person's sex actually was. And then even beyond that, you're finding someone who's more visibly female, trying to explain away that the issues of why a woman would have such unwomanly goods and ignoring larger trends. So I'm going to give you a couple of different examples today of what my research has come up with. And the first one is coming out of what's called early Bronze Age Anatolia. So I'm looking primarily at the central region, as you can see, what you're looking at right now. The center area of modern day Turkey, and this kind of brighter green color is the study area I was looking at. In the course of the early Bronze Age, so what is the early Bronze Age, you might wonder? This is a time period that lasts about 1,000 years. It is quite a long period of time in which the civilizations of central Anatolia went from being smaller, more open farming societies to urbanization with large walled urban centers ruled over by some sort of central authority. This is a major change in this region, and it came with a lot of different ways of changes of way of life and how people were being perceived, and especially the kinds of roles people had in society, the creation of things like classes and larger gender disparity as well. Larger amounts of trade, and with trade comes more warfare. As people are more aware of outside forces, you might want to fight those outside people as well. So the dichotomy between opening up and trade and the increases in violence in regions. So this is a time period in which you don't have any kind of empires yet at all. You have the creations of city centers that are still learning how to be cities. And that's the kind of time period I'm particularly looking at. My larger work in this type of study, what my book will be coming out is talking about, my dissertation work was about, is that there is a huge increase in violence during this time period. Before the rise of urbanism, you do see evidence of violence here and there, but it's not systematic and it's not endemic to these civilizations. It seems more sporadic. With the rise of urbanism in all the different regions of the Near East, at least, you see suddenly the creations of things like weapons caches, far higher amounts of violence on the bodies, and fortification systems, iconography depicting warriors. They all begin in earnest during this time period. Unfortunately, in Anatolia, we are not great at iconography. You get fantastic stuff from Egypt, of course, and Mesopotamia and Levant, but here in this areas of modern day Turkey, they weren't the most artistic, or not, or at least whatever it is, it's not being preserved very well. But the iconography we do have seems to indicate an evidence of the rise of a ruling class, with evidence of like these men, and you can see this kind of chair, evidence of some sort of ruling and higher class is being created, as well as ideas of religion. So, and also evidence of violence. You can see these things on the right. These are little seals for various purposes. You can see people being chewed up, headless bodies, evidence of warfare, evidence of power, and evidence of religion. It's a type of iconography we are getting from Anatolia in this early time period. So one of the first ones I want to talk about is this very famous case from a site called Alacahuyuk. So Alacahuyuk is one of the bigger cities in this early Bronze Age period, located in central Turkey. And from this excavations that was found there from this period of time, there were 14 burials that are often called the so-called royal tombs of Alacahuyuk. There are other tombs that were found from the same time period that were very, very simple. But in just these 14 tombs, about 700 different burial goods were found among the various inhabitants. Most tombs had about 2 to 3 people per tomb. And within these were all kinds of really fantastically made materials, including things like standards, vessels, ornaments, seals, as well as a very high number of weapons, and including the oldest known iron dagger in the world to date anyway. Every single one of these graves included weapons. And what's also interesting about this case is that the women and men were equally represented among these 14 graves. People often see this as signs of a very rich ruling class who were really active in trade and had a lot of very nice stuff, but there did not seem to be any kind of differentiation in terms of male and female in the types of materials they were having. So So there are equal the same number of weapons, as well as ornaments, as well as you can see this kind of these wonderful standards that look like all kinds of animals made out of silver and gold and copper. Really a fantastic collection. We don't have a lot of evidence of the burials of elites from this time period in Anatolia. This is our best example. And what we do see is at least what they're being buried with, even if it's ceremonial, is ceremonial weapons that are not differentiated by gender. So what about the common graves? That's our best example of elites. So when I looked at this project, I covered approximately 30 something sites, but not every single site had good burials. Not every single site was able to have, this is all based on published information. So one of my big projects here is re-looking through what's been published already. So looking at common graves and cemetery sites. And of course, this requires people to publish burial by burial publication information about burial goods, as well as biological, archaeological information about the sex of individuals. There aren't that many sites that actually do this, but within this, there are these 6 particular sites that have the best publications, in which I was finding on average about half of the adult women were being buried with weapons. And this was something that people had not noticed before. Even within the publications of these sites themselves, the publishers, the excavators published information, but never commented on the fact that women were being buried with weapons in very, very high numbers. So what I did find here is that absolutely no children, anybody under puberty was buried with weapons, male or female. So no children buried with weapons. A lot of sites, nearly all men had weapons of various sorts. Well, about half the adult women were being buried with various types of weapons. So you can see the raw data more or less here. Along with the same time is a huge increase in violence upon the bodies being found in these same exact cemeteries. And what you're often finding is a lot of cranial trauma that would be very common with evidence of warfare, as opposed to somebody getting into a fight over domestic issues or things like this. Also a lot of what's called perifractures, which is the kind of fractures you get if you're trying to protect yourself from someone attacking you, and a lot of violence to the backs of people perhaps running away and being attacked from behind. The site, particularly at Iquiz Tepe, which has the largest cemetery yet known from this time period, almost to 18.9% of the population had some form of very serious trauma that would only really result from this kind of interpersonal violence. And it's incredibly high numbers of violence. What you see here is a violent time period with a lot of weapons being placed in graves. And what do you find if you actually look at these numbers is there are particular weapons that tend to be with females if you look at the raw data. In particular, what you're finding is women have daggers and spears. So these are small handheld weapons, something that doesn't require a lot of training, and something you can kind of keep around on your person very, very easily. While men have a wider range of weapons being buried with them, they also do have daggers and spears. They also have things like mace heads, axes, and swords, so a larger amount of materials. And one thing I can also say is looking at the weapons themselves is these are not ceremonial weapons. The kinds of weapons you're finding here in the common graves, as opposed to the ones from that site, Aladra Huyuk, these are weapons with signs of wear. They are made of kind of more easily obtained materials, and often they be ceremonially broken before being placed in the grave. So purposely destroyed and placed next to the bodies so that they are being basically killed along with their owner. In my paper about this, I have a lot more information about concepts of ownership and burials, which I don't have time to quite go much into today, but you can ask me questions if you like afterwards. But I do have good reason to think that these are meant to be the private property of these individuals, as opposed to ceremonially placed weapons. So that is my main overview of the early Bronze Age. But I want to go now into Old Kingdom and pre-dynastic Egypt. This is a longer period of time than what I'm talking about in Anatolia, but in particular, I'm looking at a similar cultural time period. So before the rise of large urban centers, and before Egypt itself is centralized, indeed before it's even really united into a single state kingdom with the beginning of the first dynasty. So roughly contemporaneous in an earlier time period in Turkey, but with a similar social sort of network of what's happening here. So the same idea of the rise of urbanism, but at the end of this, you have the first kings. And by the very end, which I don't really want to cover because it's something very different, you have pyramids, but that's just kind of a fun little fact. So what you have in Egypt, though, is really fantastic preservation, which we do not get in Turkey. So you get really wonderfully preserved burials, which makes it a lot easier to tell things like sex of the remains, as well as a lot more iconography, which tells us different kinds of stories than those I can get out of Anatolia. And I want to give, this is a later time period, but I want to give you an example of often how in the past, women with weapons were undertaken in archaeological publications by Egyptologists. This particular tomb is called Seneptisi. She's a 12th dynasty person, the Middle Kingdom. And within her tomb were found the following things: an alabaster mace head, which is ceremonial, a rock crystal mace head, a dagger in sheath, and a large number of staves, which are basically just kind of hidden sticks. And so when the excavators found this, they were very upset, in fact, by this. And so they're like, well, this must be some good reason why she had materials like this. And what they kind of came up with is that she was probably being, it was some sort of protection against the supernatural. And I love this quote here. This is so, it's a 1916 publication, guys. So it's a pretty quite old, but they actually bemoan how annoying it is that they have to rely on actually looking at the skeleton to determine sex. They're like, well, we were really just used to looking at materials. We don't actually have to look at the actual skeletons. And isn't that quite obnoxious that we're forced to do something besides look at grave goods? And I find this to be just wonderfully obnoxious about this. And so they talk about how this is male materials, and they have this wonderful theory they come up with that obviously what it is that she is a woman, but in order to go to the afterlife, she'll have to become a man. And thus, by having male materials, she is thus becoming a male and able to go with Osiris after death. Again, I love this theory also because there are other women from the same area, from the same time period, who do not have any of these male attributes. And there's no discussion about how they are trying to become males or not. They make up an entire theory for a single woman's materials. And I just find this to be wonderful in a very frustrating way. So in general, we have a better idea of concepts of gender in pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom Egypt. There are very clear ideas of gender roles and what they are and what men and women should be doing. And in terms of the art history and the artistic representations of males versus females in Old Dynastic and Early Dynastic and Old Kingdom Egypt, they do have a clear sense of what's male and female and how to symbolize male and female attributes. Women themselves are seen as creatures of creation and renewal, as mothers. They present home and safety, then protection of the center. Again, I want to talk about this protection of the center and protection from chaos. So one of the things you do find about how women are described is not just meek individuals who are there, but the people who live in the center, who protect the center and protect from chaos from the outside world. A lot of Egyptian concepts are really to do with chaos versus peace. And the women are the protectors from chaos in a lot of these early writings. You often do see, of course, the idea of Egyptian kings and men as warriors. It's some of the most common art historical materials we see. In this Nasser palette, you can see already the very first images of Pharaoh as a man smiting away his enemies and so on and so forth. Very common stuff you see in Egyptian. What you do see, especially in this earlier time period, is that women are often brought along to war and are companions in war at times as well. So you will see Pharaoh followed along behind by a wife, and even other examples of warriors who women are supporting. This is a later time period just to make a different kind of case. But the idea of women being supportive, again, we come back to Tutankhamun and Akhsenamun, where she is handing him his next arrow. So women are not necessarily warriors in this case, but they are seen as sometimes companions and helpmates when it comes to these kinds of materials. You also do see examples of goddesses. There's a number of very fierce goddesses who are seen in the Egyptian pantheon who are there to support. And you also have a lot of poetry about the idea of, for instance, Hathor, you can see in this picture here. They're in the, so surrounding and protecting the pharaoh in times of war. So women as supports. And in the same exact picture here in the bottom corner, what do you see? So you look very carefully, it's much, much smaller, but you see this Pharaoh is smiting this enemy person, but in the very corner, his wife and children are actually along with this. So they are being pictured in this scene of subjection, where they are kind of have this very subdued style along with their husband, their father. So idea of women being at the edges of war and being around war is something you do see in Egyptian art historical representations of warfare. Within Egypt itself, just beyond art history, though, there is evidence of armed women within this area, especially in the earlier time periods. And so one thing I looked at was a lot of these pre-dynastic, very early graves. And again, these are excavated primarily in the 19th century, in which the excavators, for the most part, Flinders Petrie was a very good excavator for the time period, and at least he often gave the raw data. So going a lot through these older excavation reports, able to find grave by grave representations of what the burial goods were. And I did find that even though he, again, did not ever comment on it, I still was finding a large number, not quite as high as Anatolia, but numbers of women who are being buried with weapons inside these common types of graves. So within these, you're finding all kinds of different simple weapons, flint knives, obsidian knives, bow and arrow heads, copper axes, lance heads, various mace heads. And within this, there were, said that the preservation wasn't always what you might want, but 9 male identified graves with weapons and 7 female identified graves with weapons. All graves with weapons contain a number of other grave goods. So you can see even in Egypt, you are finding from these earlier time periods, evidence of males and females being given types of weapons and being buried with them. A later time period from the 6th dynasty, this is still in the Old Kingdom, a little bit earlier in the Old Kingdom. You do see, for example, this idea of a female guard. This is a good example of the ways that women in this earlier time periods could be seen as actual physical protectors. So she is working for directly the king, and she is a guard and protector of the king, which is interesting because in Egyptian styles of writing, you always show if someone is male or female. And Merentenbi, who is a woman, is not given the female determinative. She's basically unsexed and is shown as a protector of the king physically and has the attributes in her tomb of an actual bodyguard. So you can see I have a kind of different kinds of examples here that I'm going through. I forgot 2 slides for some reason, other sites I found, and I'm really sorry about that. But I kind of want to talk a little more about this idea. So this time of urbanism in the rise of big sites, the rise of warfare and in violence. Why are women being found with weapons in various types of ways? And I have as my example, this is on my poster for this, and it's also in the background of the tombs the whole time, one of my favorite pieces of Egyptian art. And it's a very simple one. It's not famous. It's not particularly well done, but this comes from the Old Kingdom period, and it's from the tomb of Anta, located in the town of Sati, and again, discovered by Flinders Petrie. So you take a look more carefully at what you see in this depiction. I really just take a second and try to read the story here. And what you see is evidence of a very fierce, very bloody, and very upsetting battle. This is a particularly horrible story being told here. And what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is outside the city wall. So over here on the right is inside the city, and the left is outside the city. This is just a piece that was broken off. That's not anything in particular. So on the outside of the city, you see the evidence of the attackers. So the attackers are wearing short kilts, they have short hair, and they have a lot of kinds of swords and staves and things like that. So these short-haired, short-kilted men are attacking the people of the town. The people of the town generally have either slightly longer skirts or even some looks more like shorts. They have a longer hair and beards. You can very kind of easily tell that these two people apart. And what you do see in every instance of the local people is them being rather brutally murdered. They have multiple arrows in them, multiple spears in them. You don't see any examples on the left-hand side of any of the bearded local people actually hurting the invaders. And this is not a very nice scene. On the left-hand side, you see inside the city in which these same short-haired people have attacked the women and children. And what I find to be really interesting about this is these same short-haired attackers who are all completely fine in the on the one side are being brutally attacked by the women on the other side of this picture. So you can see the short-haired people, the women are stabbing them and they are being murdered by the women. The women here are fierce and they are protecting the children. You can see children in this picture who are looking greatly distressed, and you don't see, in fact, any women being murdered in this depiction. It's only the invaders being killed. So this is a kind of a scene of desperation. And I think it's done with a lot of care. It is assumed that the short-haired people are the people who make this, the Tomb of Anti's point of view. This is a victorious battle, but the women here are being shown as protectors of hearth and home, and they are fierce and they are doing the best they can in the final stages of this battle. But ultimately it ends on the bottom register with the taking away of the women and children. So they lose this battle ultimately. The women are tied up, led away, looking back to their houses as they tie their children and themselves, being led away almost to certain slavery for the rest of their lives. So this is the kind of pivotal point, I think, of what is happening here in this early time period. So modern perceptions of warfare are so often based on what we think of. You kind of close your eyes, you think of warfare, especially like pre-modern warfare, as some sort of lineup. You have one side of soldiers, another side of soldiers, and they kind of walk to some battlefield and they line up in nice little tidy lines, and they throw things at each other, they shoot each other, they have bayonets. This idea then of warfare being at an assigned time and place. And yes, it is quite horrible and bloody, but it's entirely these males in some open plain agreeing to be there, some sense of agency almost of the men who are involved in this. This is some perceptions of war that we have. This is not at all what you see in warfare in this earlier time period. So what we don't actually see is particularly standing armies. Now that's a really important point. This Tomb of Anta is not showing evidence of a pitched battle outside a city. It's just showing an attack. This is a raid. This is a massacre of a people on this city, which is ill prepared to do anything about it. So what I was finding from my evidence in really early Egypt, as well as in pre-urban and early urban Anatolia, is there's absolutely no evidence earlier on of professional soldiers. You don't have people who are, these civilizations are currently unable to support soldiers full time. Of course, it's a big expense to support soldiers. You have to have people who are not in other ways helping out society. They're not growing anything. They're not making food. They're not making pottery. They are just there to be fed and to fight. And it's very difficult to support that. And it's an interesting idea to have a whole section of warriors who are supported by society. That's not to say that there aren't other warriors already existing. So at this time period in Anatolia, for example, you do have the earliest standing armies already in Mesopotamia. You have the rise of what's called the Akkadian Empire and the very first conquest outside of these small areas. So there is this beginnings of concepts of warrior society, of standing full-time armies. But here in Turkey, we don't have the population. We don't have the ability of society to actually support those kinds of groups of people. There isn't a strong enough centralization to do so. So when I do find evidence of war, and there is a lot of evidence of warfare and violence, what you're really seeing here is not pitched battles between people. This is not about land. We think of warfare as for ideologies, right? It's to take over land. It's to stop somebody else. It's for conquest. What we're seeing primarily in this earlier time period is not warfare for the sake of conquest, but warfare for the sake of goods, and particularly for people. So you're defending yourself against these outside groups. They might just be your neighbors from a few lands over. They're not going very far. They're not able to do that kind of work. But when somebody comes up against your village and your area, they're not there to conquer. Because in this early time period, the populations in these regions are not very large. You have all the land you could want. Land is not the problem quite yet. The populations aren't big enough to support it. So what you really need is more people to take back to your space that you already have. In Turkey in particular, there is no evidence of conquest. of cities, of other places, because they have no way to control that or to keep it once they have it. The idea hasn't been invented yet. So when you have work in these earlier time periods, what's most at stake is your goods and your women. So the women themselves are the primary prize, along with animals and along with any kind of trade goods that are happening in this time period. So when you look at what's happening here, what's being taken and what's being found, is these types of weapons that women are being buried with are not weapons that you're trained to use. They are not swords, which are actually quite expensive to make right now and incredibly rare, and do take up a amount of knowledge. These are short, stabby things, like you see in the tomb of Anta, that in times of great distress, you can defend yourself at the last minute. You're able to protect yourself as best you can. So this is not an idea of a warrior princess or warrior groups. These aren't the Scythians from later on time periods. These definitely are not the Amazons of mythology. What's really happening here, as far as I can tell, is this protection in a time of great chaos and uncertainty, in which women have to protect themselves if, as you see at the tomb of Anta, the men are unable to do so. Well, I can't really speak of how people within these societies would have felt about this. I have no iconography, I have no text, I have no way to speak for the women themselves. But I think what we're really seeing here is this kind of protection of the women for themselves. I think it really comes out with what kinds of weapons we are seeing versus what the males are being buried with. So I'll say a couple more things, but I'll get to my last slide here. So kind of my bigger points then is just that this is a story that is very easily lost. It's easy to just look at weapons and collect them. A lot of these archaeological publications I was going with have all this data, but it's easy to overlook because you can study just the weapons. You can study just the injuries on the people together, but this is a very large project that took me years of putting together to try to find and to put together the evidence to show the stories of these women and the kinds of dangerous lives they were living at this time period, and how that can really change our understandings of early urbanism, the place of women in warfare, and how they were able to protect themselves until in the late, as these things got, as warfare became even more endemic, they were able to have standing arms to protect themselves. So that is my project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Mary.
Yes, supposedly I'm supposed to have something useful to say. At least I can warm up the rest of the audience to ask some questions. So it's interesting to compare what you're discussing with other theories about metallurgy that are going on. And I'm sure in your larger, more complex version of this project, you discuss that. So there's been, for example, a lot of study of the use of pins in graves and how what that represents. And secondly, the idea that weapons, at least when they first appear, are less about fighting and more about demonstrating hegemony. So I don't know how you're thinking about that. And then, so I'm going to ask you about that. And the other one is that it's interesting to compare this. As I am sure you are aware, there are a lot of people who fantasize about pre-Indo-European matriarchal kind of societies in Anatolia. And what you're arguing doesn't contradict that, at least. And then my third question is, the raids are for people, you're saying, and not for objects? So those are my three questions I would ask about, like how this fits in with other studies of trying to theorize metallurgy and its rise in sort of northeast Anatolia into northern Mesopotamia. And then secondly, what else, does this help you with matriarchal theories for those who want to fantasize about it? And I had a third question somewhere in there.
The third question, I didn't mean to imply objects. I just think it was women, and it's people and objects.
Right.
So
right.
I wasn't saying like they don't want stuff. No, that's not. They want stuff too. Don't get me wrong. But I think it's a combination of it's what I'm saying. It's not about land and it's not about conquest. It's about stuff, and women are considered stuff. That's kind of more what I meant by that. So I'm sorry if I misspoke a little bit there.
Do you tie in these graves with women with whatever the socioeconomic basis of these particular towns and how they fit into the larger questions of trade and cultural interaction? Like, are these in specific nodes that would be particularly vulnerable to attack or something like that?
Yeah, so you see the highest evidence of violence upon women's bodies in these major trade centers. So the problem is, of course, Turkey does not have the best preservation of human remains, and we don't have huge numbers of cemeteries. But the sites that we do have that have the best evidence, so İkiz Tepe, I think, is our best example, but that is on a major trade route going up to the north, to the Black Sea. Alacahuyuk is really right in the center, and you see this kind of evidence of glorification with using weapons, these more ceremonial in this case for elite groups. Rezaolu, for example, is another. These are major cities, and there are other cemeteries that are more off the beaten path, that are less urbanized at the same time. These are contemporaneous, where you don't see evidence of violence and you don't get weapons with women at all. And in fact, you rarely see weapons with the men. So I'm not saying this is like every single site is just covered in gore at all times, but when you do see higher evidence of trade, you see this increase in violence and the uses of women, and women being buried with these kinds of materials, as well as evidence of violence upon their bodies. So I think there's a lot to be said about the interplay between the especially trade. I think trade is really quite important about this. There's some great work by Stanich and Levine out of UCLA a couple of years back, talking about the kind of, this is more practice theory, looking at the interchange between violence and trade. And I think that's really central to this. Something I talk about more in my book quite a bit, actually. It's hard in Turkey to look at other evidence of class or what kinds of other material, like what people are doing more specifically. I really just have that example of Alacahuyuk and then pretty much everybody else. It's really hard to suss this out. Egypt's a nicer example because you get a better sense of some of these things there with preservation, and you have a lot more bodies to work with. It's just a larger data set in a lot of ways. That's why I'm kind of working a little more on that study right now, to try to like do some different kinds of examples of a similar phenomena. So going back to weapons then for a moment, and the rise of metallurgy. Just something I worked a lot more in my master's. I'm also an ancient metallurgist. It's a fascinating study altogether. And I do talk about this a fair amount as well in the ways that weapons are being used. And I think it's also why this is important when they look at the waste. Burying a weapon in a burial is a really weird thing to do. Metal is quite expensive right now. You can only really get, this is primarily arsenical bronze, which means you're not using tin. Tin is quite rare and very expensive in the ancient world. So you're not really getting a lot of tin bronzes, which makes a big difference. But you're using this kind of arsenical bronze, which is able to be made in Turkey. There's fantastic arsenical copper mines in which you can create this kinds of bronzes. In the earlier Chalcolithic period, you don't find any weapons in burials. When you do find weapons, they're in caches inside cities. They're occasionally on the rubble layers or on floors. And you do find, like, what you're finding in those kind of earlier time periods before violence is that common, is things that are a lot more for hunting, for scraping, those kinds of things that are really tools. So the biggest difference, how do you tell the difference between a tool and a weapon? That's really difficult to do because they look very, very similar. And also between ceremonial weapons versus actual weapons. And one of the easiest is mace heads, because mace heads are not something, it's a stick with a big rock on it. These are terrible for hunting. Rabbits don't really care if you want to chase them with it. You can't hunt a lion with it. Really, only people you can hurt with the mace head is another human. And that's why they are a really common symbol of violence in the Near East. You see them a lot in Egypt throughout time. They're a symbol of kind of royal violence in some ways. And you do start getting a lot of mace heads being found in male burials in both locations, but I think is one indication that these are weapons and not tools. But I think what's important is you don't get a lot of other types of, you get like the pins are great. I love pins. I actually wrote my master's on pins. They're fascinatingly interesting because they're such a good way to look at class actually for other reasons. So you get things like pins and bodies. More in later periods, start getting them now a little bit. You get things like some simple like awls and needles and things like that made of metal. I get a lot of pots, of course. But I think in particular, weapons require a lot more metal than other types of materials. And so when you have them in this kind of context, they do say something about the importance and why they are being left with these people and why they aren't being reused. You don't get as many tools in burials as you get kinds of weapons and as you get things like that are easier to make, such as pots. So I talk more about ownership of these materials and why I think these aren't just ceremonial or why they aren't being placed there for other purposes. Of course, burials are for the living, not for the dead. You bury somebody because you're living and you want to say something about the person who is dead. So why would you put these types of materials with them? And I guess my best indication, again, is the fact that there is wear on these. They aren't super, like they aren't like broken down, but there is evidence that these are personally used items as opposed to something ceremonial. And I think the biggest indication for me is the way that they are broken, they are killed. And that kind of killing of these materials, I think, really shows that these are a little more personal in some ways. You don't kill anything else. You don't break the pots. You don't break the jewelry. The only thing that really ever is killed is these weapons that show, I think, a little more personality to them in the way that these are seen as almost living in some certain ways. I don't think they're alive, obviously, but they have a kind of a deeper meaning in a time in which metals are still pretty rare and are still quite expensive. And these aren't graves of rich people either. These are common people. So I think it just has a little more meaning because of that. If that's not too long, if that answers your question a little bit. There's so much you can say about metallurgy. It's, and especially in this time period, it's really fascinating. And your second question.
I guess I was asking, as you are well aware, the fantasies of the earlier times in Anatolia with the idea that sisters are the ones that bring kingship with you. You've got the story of the Queen of Kanesh, for example, and her 30 daughters. I don't know. I mean, that's the best you're going to get in terms of like texts that might help you.
Yeah, so the concepts of the matriarchal society in Turkey, which there is a lot that talks about that. I try not to truck with it too much. There's some wonderful stuff from Egypt, though, that I didn't have a chance to go into here. In the really early Egypt, so not even pre-dynastic, the really early stuff, you get this fantastic cow goddess being scraped all over the Western desert. And she is just this super protective female cow who's like goring her enemies. And this, what they can understand is earlier on, especially, this seemed to be the primary god before Horus and Osiris became, there's a great book on this. It's so good. I'm not sure I entirely buy it 100%, but I think it's I kind of almost do. I love this idea of this protective cow. And I think you call someone a cow now, it's pretty mean. But this idea of, because have you ever gone after, you know, cows are kind of like quiet little animals. If you have a cow with a calf, she will charge you. They're terrifying. Do not go after a female cow with a calf. Cows are protective. So this idea of like the women and the cows and the protectiveness, and I think there's kind of something there about the way women are protecting themselves. Like, what that has to do with Indo-European matriarchal societies, I don't really want to guess about that, but I think you can if you like. But
I just felt the need to say that to get it out of the way. That's all.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
There, Stephanie, and I can see now we're getting some good questions in the chat. So,
okay. Should I? Oh, there's a lot. Wow. Okay, let's see.
I think maybe we can talk about Isaac's question first here at 7:51.
Yeah.
Were these women being taken as wives or for labor? And did Egypt rate for people more because they didn't need or want to expand as much as opposed to comparatively resource-poor Mesopotamia?
No, that's a good question. It's hard to say exactly what the women, I mean, my theory is that they're being used kind of for both. I mean, I think someone said later on, they're not wives, they're captives. And I think that's a fair point, but this is a pretty harsh time in which they would have been used for breeding, let's say. I think it's a more accurate word. This is not a voluntary relationship, but these women were being used to create more children. And also it's labor. It's not either or, it is both. Like, women are useful because women are the ones who, again, make children. They can make the homes, as well as often having a lot of very practical skill, not just cooking, but making of pots. There's a lot of evidence women make beer, and everyone loves beer. So this kind of thing that women have the cultural knowledge to pass on in so many ways. So it is kind of both. I think in terms of Egypt rating more for people, That's a good question. I've not found a lot in Mesopotamia, but the evidence of burials from this time period, we have some really fantastic elite stuff. There's so little burial information from common people, just because the way Mesopotamia was excavated in the 19th and earlier 20th century is I can't talk Mesopotamia. I just don't know anything about it. I've not found data to go with, so I can't really guess. It'd just be making things up in my head, and I don't really want to do that entirely. It's a great question and one I'd love to go into more, and I've just not found the data so far.
Okay. Can I actually add to that, because I have a question related to it? I think your talk seemed to give me a different understanding of what Homer is describing in the Iliad, all those raids that are going on, right? And we actually do have people that have half brothers, for example, Ajax, right? Mm-hmm. Has a half brother that was bred with a captive, probably.
Yes.
So that's why I wonder if they are kind of wise, because the brothers are not the same, they don't have the same status, but still they travel as warriors along with everybody else.
Yeah, and I think they would have been considered wives. It's a forced wife. I think the Iliad, I think, is a great example. There are so many women who are taken from various places, but their children do have status. It's different necessarily, but there's a lot of women in the Iliad who are taken along, to put it very nicely. What's actually a pretty series of rather more nasty stories. But yeah, I think that's a really good parallel there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we have Joshua Hall at 755. The idea of killing weapons is prominent in early Iron Age Greece as well. Matthew Lloyd published this a bit. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's something you do see here and there. It's not universal by any means, but there are other examples. Like this is a good example here. And I have heard of this a little bit too. So this is something you do see in different places. And I think there are even some Roman examples I come across. And a little bit the Scythians do this as well sometimes. So there is a lot of different examples, not all the time, not everywhere, but people do occasionally kill weapons.
Well, in ancient Germany, for example, you find them in the Rhine River or something, bent weapons, for example.
Yeah, there's different reasons. Like killing your weapon, I think, is a really powerful symbol. People get really attached to their weapons. Have some phallic stuff there if you like too, but that could be a different talk.
Then Zeke Drucker is asking, how do the weapons, both in type and quantity, vary according to the women's socioeconomic class? Was there a difference in the function of violence by class?
That's really something I like to know more about. I don't have a lot of class differences very visible. My best examples, again, from Iquiz Tepe, this largest site, where there is some indication of different classes to some extent. It's the biggest cemetery we have from this time period. And what you do find is better metals. So the site of Alajahuyuk, which is an elite burial site, the weapons are ceremonial, which I find to be interesting. So you have an iron dagger with a gold hilt. It would have been useless. It's a terrible weapon, but it's beautifully made. And so the weapons there are often made of gold, which you should never use as a sword. It'll just bend. Silver, which is shiny, but again, it's terrible. So you find more ceremonial because people probably weren't necessarily fighting. They were just kind of, getting themselves all dolled up for it. But what you do see, from what I can tell a little bit, I need to do a little more work with this too, is there's different qualities of bronze, where you have some that are better made and are better cast and better put together, versus ones that are a little less well made, as well as some stone tools. We don't get a lot of stone weapons already in this time period, a lot of stone tools for other uses, but you're not really finding a lot of stone besides mace heads. So I'm having a hard time picking up class just because of the preservation and the kinds of burials I'm seeing. And also, we're still really early in urbanism, so there's a kind of a higher elite class, and then this would be kind of everybody else. We're not really seeing things like slavery. We're not seeing like a middle class going on here, especially in Turkey yet. So things are still a little more even in terms of just kind of a dichotomy. Are you elite or are you not? There's not much difference otherwise.
Good. Then I have Morgan Wiggert here. After re-examining graves, what is the percentage of graves that turned out to be women instead of men?
In Anatolia, I'm only able to go off what's been published recently. So the ones I'm working with, the problem in Anatolia is up until 1960, after they looked at the burials, they often threw the bodies away. Occasionally they would keep skulls, sometimes they wouldn't. So I actually don't have a lot of redone sexing of burials in Anatolia, just because we don't have the bodies. So the ones I've been going off of are stuff from the 70s and onwards, where we already had good methodologies happening. So in Turkey, none. People just weren't acknowledging the weapons in the burials at all. But from Egypt, it's getting higher and higher. And there's actually been some fantastic studies in Naqada burials where they've gone through the bodies again and started resexing them as well. So in Egypt, this is becoming more common. I think people are kind of reestablishing this, like that, those silly 1916 publications being like, oh, that they wanted to be Osiris and how dare she be so hard to figure out. So a lot of that stuff is being redone. There's been some great dissertations lately re-examining these 19th century materials because they still exist. But I'm really a big fan of people doing the dissertation work on published data or on museum data, because there's so much to be done and there's so many things we've missed. We're not a very old field, but our technologies and our methodologies have changed so much.
There's a question from Karen Carr. Do you think people ever loot these graves for weapons? Can we think of them burying weapons as a kind of emergency savings vault?
There's no evidence of people looting them in the past. I mean, these aren't really rich enough to be worth it. I've actually seen no evidence in Turkey of ancient looting. Modern looting, just ever so much, yes. But again, the breaking of weapons, I think, really does go against that. Like, not every single one is broken, but often, like, there is a high percentage of broken weapons. So I don't think this is meant to be a cache. You don't see people in earlier time periods in Turkey, Neolithic time period, for example, people actually would open up graves, take out skulls and do interesting things like that. You don't really see evidence of people going into graves, except occasionally just to add more people into them. So it's a good question, but I don't see any evidence of that. Even in Egypt, I'm looking at pretty low class graves. So again, people wouldn't bother. There's much nicer stuff to loot nearby.
Right.
Thanks.
And we have a question again from Joshua Hall. I do have a question about changes in mortuary evidence. You noted that we see weapons in female burials fall off after centralization. Is there a correlation between this and fortification, or is it only aggregation in urban centers?
So that's a great question. Actually, no. So the fortifications come first before aggregation. And that's one thing you really do see. So at the start of the early Bronze Age, nearly every single slightly large for the time center had no walls, with a couple exceptions of ones that are along the coast that were major maritime sea routes already. So this place called Mersin already had walls by the Chalcolithic, and that's really unusual. By the end of the early Bronze Age period, every single major center has walls without exception. So really, at the same time you're finding women with these kinds of weapons, at the same time you're finding evidence of violence in the bodies, people are building fortification walls in already surprisingly advanced styles. And in the next period, in the Middle Bronze Age, where these places are really centralized, the walls remain and the weapons go away from graves a lot, and definitely from the women entirely. So the fortifications are concurrent.
Did you find any weapons factories at these early dates?
Factories is a strong word. What we do find is molds for things like, not mace heads, that'd be silly. Things swords like spears. Swords and daggers and spears. We do find the molds for those. These are done on such small scale. In the southeastern Anatolia contemporaneously, which is also part of northern Mesopotamia, you do find much larger scale, and you find things like major weapons caches. That's a very different culture.
Any other questions, or should I ask all my questions?
There's one from Sean here about the tomb of Anta.
That's right. Good.
Yes. So it's hard to say in some ways. I mean, this is a tomb that's well documented in a lot of ways. So it's thought that Anta was this kind of nobility person, and that so the people with the short hair are the good guys. They are raiding a village, and Anta is thought to most likely just have been sort of commander for this kind of raid. So it's just a show of what a really, really good mass murderer he was, I imagine. And that's kind of the general thought in the publications for that. The target audience is, well, this is a tomb. So the target audience is Anta himself and the gods. No, tombs weren't for public viewing after the fact.
Right. Makes sense.
So the black.
Could some of these objects have been? No, wait a minute. This is on the walls of the tomb, right?
Yes, it's on the walls.
Yes.
Of the tomb.
Okay. So yeah, nobody would have seen that beforehand.
No.
Yeah.
So you get evidence from the Black Sea region, from the Aegean. So the Black Sea, yes. So Iquios Tepe is on the Black Sea. There isn't much else from the Black Sea in this. That is a major site. Black Sea is good for a lot of later time periods. You don't have as many early Bronze Age sites there that have been excavated so well. So I use the Black Sea, which is possible. There's a couple other smaller sites I included in my data, but that's the bigger one. The Aegean, I've been working a little bit on. I have a colleague of mine named Pinar Dugun, who is done more work on that side. So I actually didn't do as much because I didn't want to step on her toes. So she's working more on that herself. I'm just doing that. That's why I didn't publish these together ultimately. My paper that's published is only on the Anatolian information, and I'm going to try to add more Aegean stuff along with we're probably going to co-author a paper. The Egyptian stuff is just kind of more just my attempts at comparisons to similar time periods, and I realize they're not exactly the same, but I liked it also just because the visuals are quite nice for a talk like this, and I'm working on a publication that's just on Egypt. I can't do Mesopotamia, and I haven't seen as much. I'm working a little bit in Levant too. I'm trying to expand this as much as I can. That's a good point. Thank you, Valerie.
So how big were these cities, the earliest cities? You have a reconstruction. I don't know which city that was. And it looks quite big.
Yeah, they're relatively big. They'd be probably, they're not gigantic in some ways, but they would have been some in the neighborhood of, like, the bigger ones are about 10 to 20 hectares. And so maybe the population would probably be, a couple thousand, not like they're not big compared to Mesopotamia at the same time. Like right now, contemporaneously, we have like Uruk with 100,000 people. We are nowhere close. I know Akkad in Mesopotamia is already a major city center. We are much smaller in Turkey than anything happening in a lot of other places. Like, it's just, that's why I kind of like this study, and why I like Central Turkey for this time period, is things are just on a smaller scale and they're a lot more isolated. I don't talk about this much, but there's a kind of older reports talking about incursions, Mesopotamia or from the Aegean into this area, and how that was responsible for violence. As I did Indo-European incursions from the Northeast and such. And one of the things I'm really finding is not really any evidence of outsiders. Like when I say like these attacks are from nearby neighbors, they're from the same region. I don't see any evidence in the violence, in the styles of weapons, which is I think a big one. There is trade, but there's even some outside trade too. But I don't see any evidence of large outside groups coming in. And even the Akkadians claim they do, and I think they're lying. All they got is one pot. But my evidence of the Akkadians is a single pot. That's not good enough for me. I think, Naram Sin's known to be a liar, so let's not go off of that.
Okay.
Do you think these?
Can I ask you about? Oh, wait a minute. There's another one. I'll let you answer Karen's.
Do you think these raiders would be selling their captives to South Mesopotamia? There's no really reason to think that. They would want them for themselves. I mean, that's a great question. I can't say for sure the answer is no, but I would think not. Mesopotamia is kind of doing its own thing right now, and they have their own kind of style of warfare going on. Yeah, I don't think so. I have my own other thoughts about Akkad, but I don't have time for that. Really, it's a whole other story.
So this is all kind of localized, which again would actually mean that what Homer depicts is something special, right? I mean, would also explain why everybody's talking about Troy, because it's the first time that outsiders actually attack a city coming from far away, right?
Well, so Troy is a bit later. So Troy actually does exist. Early Bronze Age Troy right now is actually pretty fascinating already. It's a really cool site. So what you're seeing there is a site that is literally guarding the only way into the Black Sea. And it's, I mean, really cool. By the time of the Trojan War, that's the late Bronze Age period, in which case Central Anatolia is opened up. It's the height of the Hittite Empire. They are conquering Syria. They're going to war with Egypt. So it's a very different time period, in which it's nothing at all like this. And you have gigantic armies, and you have monumental architecture and everything else. So Troy is kind of part of this much larger, much more connected world, where they're fighting both the Aegean as well as the Hittites. And we have like these fantastic Hittite texts where they're like talking to Troy, and it's cool stuff. It's a very different story by then.
But some of the stuff that Schliemann found is, of course, from much earlier than that Homeric period.
Yes.
And I don't know how much earlier it is, if it actually goes into the early Bronze Age even.
Yeah, so Troy is founded at the very start of the early Bronze Age, and it's one of the very first sites to have walls. Like the walls of Troy are, they're justifiably famous. So Troy 1, the very first level, dates the start of the early Bronze Age, and it's already a well-made city, has a good wall, has these beautiful, I'm going to blank on the name, a certain type of elongated building that has a fire in the center.
Megaron.
Megaron, thank you. I'm like, yeah, it has these wonderful, they already have the Megarons, they have these great walls, they have great pottery. Yeah, so by the early Bronze Age, you already have Troy as a well-defended city. So they are starting this off on a pretty strong note. And again, because they are a maritime city, the same way, like, you really, the coasts and the major travel routes are the ones you really find this going on first. I don't believe there's a lot of burials out of Troy from this earlier time period. I don't think I've ever seen any excavations that talk about burials from there.
Right, that would have been my next question. I know that they found a lower city in the 1990s.
They did, but I don't think they never found a cemetery.
No cemeteries.
No cemeteries. There's some later ones, but not early.
There is a cemetery associated with Troy, and it even looks like there was some excavation done there at the beginning of the Iron Age, and some things removed and brought back to the temple complex there on the edge, the sanctuary complex along the edge, and then ritually buried. So there is, it's like early Mycenaean in date. It's not really a contemporaneous, but you know that of course there are lots of stories about enemies coming from afar to sack cities. It's just that it's rare to have the enemy be the good guys.
Yes.
Naram Sin has the classic story in which he talks about that.
Yeah. I mean, actually, my thoughts of Naram Sin is like they talk about, he crosses the Euphrates River and comes into, and there's like one stela where he has a Trojan style cup. The Nasiriyah stele. It's really cool. My thoughts actually about that are mostly just that he was also raiding. Like he conquered Mesopotamia, and I think he raided once and twice into Anatolia and called it a day. That's in a nutshell my thoughts about that stuff. But he definitely did enter Anatolia. I just think he just raided like everybody else did. Too far away to do much else. But he definitely has a Trojan cup, which is really neat.
Well, I think I don't see any more questions in the chat part. So I think we've tormented you long enough. So thank you so much for a very lively and interesting talk. And if anybody wants to just stick around and chat a little bit longer, we can, even about stuff that has nothing to do with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Stephanie. Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
At long last.
Yes.
I'm happy we're able to get this together.
And I guess I could see people joining us from Evergreen and from Reed and from University of Oregon, maybe Portland State, and I see Puget Sound was there, University of Washington was there. So it definitely had a much bigger reach than it would have had if you had actually given it on the Willamette campus on March 20th, 2020. So that was a good thing. We might have gotten more people in there, in the flesh, but this is still good. I mean, I think Zoom is still something that deters people. We don't have the same kind of audiences that we normally would have in a live talk, but it's nice that we can reach out a little bit more. And Karen, I think, are you still in Michigan? I can't hear you right now.
Sorry. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh, Providence, Rhode Island. I mean, that's fantastic, right? I mean, it also means that.
But it's great that I was able to join.
It's so late for you.
Here.
Thank you for coming. This is a late time.
That's why I'm so poorly lit, because I'm tired.
Yeah, I understand that for sure. Good. But yeah, it's wonderful that in that way we actually can reach people that are, much further away. I know when we had our Kaplan conference, we actually had a couple of people from the UK And even somebody from Germany was there, I think, and somebody from Switzerland. And we normally wouldn't have that kind of audience, right? So in that sense, it's a great supplementation, so to say, of what we can normally do. And at the same time, I really hope that we can burn our masks at some point and go back to live exchanges.
Yeah, it's also just nice to be able to meet people in person and to have a conversation before and after. It's
right, right.
Something like this is a nice conversation, but it's a little bit nicer just to be able to.
Yes, and it's also not the same thing to drink your wine or whatever else.